The air is thick with smoke. Through the heavy cedar doors of the palace, screams echo, sounds that no one in this city has heard for hundreds of years. In the scriptorium, the scribe's room, the king's hand trembles as he presses a sharp stylus into soft clay. Every movement is desperate. Every cuneiform mark is a plea for help. This is Ugarit, a port metropolis on the coast of Syria. Think of it as the New York of the Bronze Age, a crossroads of cultures, languages, and, most importantly, money. But now its streets are burning, and King Ammurapi is writing to his only ally, who might still save him. The letter is addressed to the king of Al-Ashia, modern-day Cyprus. "My father," he writes, "the enemy's ships are already here. They have burned my cities with fire and committed atrocities in my land. Do you not know? All my troops are in the land of the Hittites, and all my fleet is in the land of Luca. They have not yet returned. The country is left to itself." He pauses, listening to the roar of the fire and the crackle of collapsing walls. His army is far away. His fleet is far away. He is alone. His great city, which has stood for centuries, is dying before his eyes. He finishes the letter, and a servant hastily places the clay tablet into a kiln. The fire is meant to harden it, to make the message eternal. But it is the same fire that is already devouring his palace. The letter will never be sent. 3,000 years later, archaeologists sifting through the ashes of the palace will find this small tablet, perfectly baked in the fire that destroyed the city. It was the last message sent from a world that ceased to exist an instant later. And Ugarit was not alone. From Greece to Egypt, almost every major city of that era met the same fate. Entire empires that had flourished for 1,000 years were wiped off the face of the earth in just one generation. It was an apocalypse, a systemic collapse that plunged humanity back into darkness for hundreds of years. And behind it all was a mysterious enemy, a ghost that the Egyptians simply called the Sea Peoples. Today, we open a 3,200-year-old cold case. We will hunt the ghosts that burned the world. And we will ask a terrifying question. Could it happen again? Imagine 1250 BC, 100 years before the Bible was written, and 500 years before the founding of Rome. The world of the Eastern Mediterranean was not wild and barbaric. It was prosperous, rich, and incredibly interconnected. It was the first globalized world in history. On the map of power, there were three main players, the three superpowers of the time. To the south, eternal Egypt. The empire of pharaohs like Ramesses the Great reveled in the gold of the Nile and built monuments that would survive millennia. Egypt was old money, a cultural giant that looked down on the others a bit. To the north, in modern-day Turkey, ruled the Hittite Empire. These were warriors and diplomats, masters of chariots and bureaucracy. The Hittites were the only force capable of speaking with Egypt as equals. Their capital, Hattusa, was an impregnable mountain fortress from which they governed their vast territory. And to the west, in Greece and the Aegean Islands, the Mycenaeans flourished. The ancestors of the very Greeks about whom Homer wrote. They were seafarers, traders, and pirates. Their palace citadels, like Mycenae with its famous Lion Gate, were centers of a maritime empire that controlled trade routes. These three giants, along with the smaller kingdoms of Assyria and Babylon, formed what historians call the Great Powers Club. Their kings called each other brother in their letters. They exchanged lavish gifts, arranged dynastic marriages, and signed complex international treaties, carving them onto silver tablets. Their world was bound together by trade. Ships constantly crisscrossed the Mediterranean, carrying copper from Cyprus, gold from Nubia, wine from Greece, and cedar from Lebanon. But the main engine of this era was one metal, bronze. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin. Copper was readily available, but tin was incredibly rare. The nearest deposits were thousands of miles away, possibly in modern-day Afghanistan. This meant that to create their swords, armor, and tools, the great empires depended on an incredibly long and fragile supply chain. This was their version of the internet and the global economy, powered by clay tablets and ships laden with tin. And like our system, it created immense wealth, but also immense vulnerability. To the people living then, this world seemed eternal. Palaces were filled with treasures. Scribes kept detailed records of every jar of oil. Armies seemed invincible. This system worked. It was stable. It was the pinnacle of human development at that time. They built a world of bronze, brilliant, powerful, and complex. But they didn't know that bronze has a fatal flaw. It is brittle. It doesn't bend. It breaks. And their world, with all its kings, gods, and gold, was about to shatter. It all started with the weather. It wasn't angry gods or bad omens. It was something slower and more relentless. Analysis of ancient pollen grains and tree rings today shows us what the Bronze Age kings could not see. Around 1250 BC, a mega-drought began in the Mediterranean, lasting for decades. The rains stopped coming. Rivers dried up. The earth cracked. This wasn't just a bad harvest. It was Bronze Age climate change. And for civilizations built on grain surpluses, it was a death sentence, just with a delayed execution. We find the first evidence of this in the archives of clay tablets. At first, there were polite requests, then increasingly desperate pleas. The king of the Hittites writes to the king of Ugarit, the very one whose last letter we found. Do you not know of the famine in my lands? It is a matter of life and death. Send me a ship with grain. Think about it. a superpower, an empire of warriors, asking its vassal for food. It's like if today the Pentagon asked Mexico for ammunition. It was humiliating. It was terrifying. It showed that the system had begun to fail at the most basic level. And then, about 13 minutes into our investigation, we find another letter. It's from a Hittite queen, and it's even more chilling in its simplicity. She writes to the Pharaoh of Egypt, the only place where the Nile still guaranteed a harvest. And in this letter, there's just one line that summarizes the entire era. There is no grain in my lands. This is a complete admission of collapse. The great Hittite Empire was starving. And when people starve, two things happen. They start to move, and they become violent. Entire villages uprooted themselves and moved wherever they could in search of food. These were the first waves of climate refugees in history. They walked the roads, carrying their children and meager belongings, but found only similarly scorched fields. Desperation grew. And then those who had boats turned to the sea. When legal trade dies, piracy flourishes. The waters of the Mediterranean, once bustling trade arteries, turned into hunting grounds. Bands of desperate people attacked coastal cities, plundering and burning them. Egyptian and Hittite texts begin to be filled with mentions of pirates, such as the Luka people. The kings of the great empires saw these problems. They saw famine. They saw pirates. They saw refugees. But they perceived them as isolated fires that could be put out. They sent armies to punish pirates. They sent ships with grain to plug the holes. They didn't understand that these weren't isolated fires. These were symptoms of a disease that had afflicted their entire civilization. Drought bred famine. Famine bred migration. Migration and famine bred piracy and war. It was a vicious cycle. A perfect storm was gathering on the horizon, and when it hit, it swept everything in its path. The perfect storm hit, and it hit with a force that no Bronze Age foundation could withstand. This was not a slow decline. It was a firestorm, a cascading collapse that swept across the entire civilized world. The Hittite Empire was the first to fall. Weakened by famine and internal strife, it became easy prey. Its proud capital, Hattusa, was not just conquered. It was burned to the ground and abandoned forever. Archaeologists find no traces of a long siege there. The end was sudden and brutal. A great empire, which for 1,000 years had been Egypt's equal, simply vanished. Its fall triggered a chain reaction. Dominoes began to fall one after another. Hittite vassal kingdoms, like Ugarit, were left unprotected. We know their fate. The king's last letter was never sent. The fire that was meant to preserve his message for centuries consumed both him and his city. The wave of destruction spread across the sea, reaching Mycenaean Greece. Nestor's palace in Pylos, known for its rich archives, burned in such a furious blaze that the clay tablets literally baked, preserving for us the last panicked records of coast watchers and unknown enemies. Then fell Tiryns and Mycenae, great citadels with their gigantic walls. Everything that constituted the glory of Mycenaean civilization was destroyed. Palaces plundered, workshops shattered, and, most terrifying of all, along with them, knowledge disappeared. Their complex writing system, Linear B, was forgotten. Imagine if today we collectively forgot how to read and write. Greece plunged into darkness for 400 years. And here, about 21 minutes into our investigation, archaeologists show us the most terrifying evidence of this apocalypse. When they excavate in any of these cities, they find the same picture. At a certain depth, they come across a thick, black layer. A layer of ash, charcoal, broken pottery, and collapsed walls. Historians call this the destruction layer. It's a clear, bold line drawn through geological time. It's a scar on the body of history that tells us everything ended here. And this scar is found everywhere, from Turkey to Greece, from Syria to Palestine. An entire world burned down at the same time. Trade routes were erased, technologies forgotten, languages lost. It was a systemic collapse of such magnitude that we can barely imagine it. The population decreased by 90%. Great cities turned into goat pastures. The world was thrown back. Almost all fell. Almost all lights of civilization went out. But one old lion stood firm. To the south, protected by the desert and a powerful fleet, Egypt managed to repel the wave. And on the walls of his temples, Pharaoh Ramesses III left us the only image of the face of the apocalypse. Egypt, Valley of the Kings. In the shadow of gigantic statues stands the mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu. Its walls are not just decoration. They are the most detailed police report of the ancient world. They are the testimony of the sole survivor of the apocalypse. On the sun-baked stone, Ramesses ordered the story of his greatest battle to be carved. And looking at these reliefs, we see the face of the enemy for the first time. It is not a shapeless horde. It is a coalition of different peoples, each with their unique weapons and appearance. Here they are, bursting into history. The battle scenes are a whirlwind of organized violence. We see a naval battle in the Nile Delta. Egyptian ships with lion heads ram enemy vessels. Egyptian archers shower their decks with arrows. Boarding hooks grapple the sides. All around, bodies of men and shattered mast fragments. Chaos. But look closely at the enemies. The pharaoh's artists depicted them with incredible accuracy. It's a kind of rogues gallery. We see men in horned helmets. These are the Shurden, who once served Egypt as mercenaries. And these, the most numerous, in tall helmets adorned with feathers. These are the Peliset. Others wear kilts and are armed with long swords. It's an entire alliance of desperate warriors. Ramesses gives them a common name. He calls them peoples from the foreign lands, or sea peoples. In his inscriptions he boasts, "No land stood before their arms, from Hatti to Cyprus." Their hearts were full of confidence, and they said, "Our plans will succeed." But then about 28 minutes into our investigation, we see a detail that changes everything. The reliefs show not only a naval battle, but also a land battle. And in this scene, behind the warriors, we see something strange. Heavy, unwieldy carts with solid wheels, and they are pulled not by horses, but by slow oxen. And on these carts sit women and children with their meager belongings. This is not an army convoy. This is an entire people on the move. This was not just an invasion for plunder. It was a migration, an armed refugee crisis. These people did not just come to conquer. They came to stay. They were looking for a new home because their old one was destroyed. Ramesses III declares a complete and crushing victory. He writes, "I overthrew them, slaughtered them in their place, and they became like those who did not exist." He saved Egypt. He repelled the wave. But he was a king in a graveyard. The world that Egypt knew and dominated was dead. Only ruins and ghosts remained. But these ghosts now had a name: the Sea Peoples. And there was a clue: their appearance. For decades, historians tried to use these clues to answer the main question. If they came from the sea, where exactly did they come from? So we have suspects, a whole gallery of faces carved on temple walls. But who are they? Where did they come from? For decades, scholars, like detectives, tried to match these faces with known peoples of the time. It was an attempt to find ground zero, the epicenter of the explosion. One of the first theories was that they were Europeans, perhaps inhabitants of the Aegean islands. Their long swords and round armor were unlike the weapons of the Near East. Could they have been Proto-Greeks, or inhabitants of Sicily and Sardinia? The name of one of the tribes, Sheridan, indeed sounds very similar to Sardinia. But there was little proof. It was just a guess. Another theory pointed to Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. After the fall of the Hittite Empire, a power vacuum emerged there. Many small kingdoms, like Lucca, were mentioned as pirates, even before the collapse. Perhaps it was them? Fragments of a collapsed empire that united and went on the pirate raid of their lives. This made sense, but didn't explain the scale of the destruction. But the most exciting clue did not come from archaeology. It came from the Bible. Let's go back to the most numerous tribe depicted on Ramesses' reliefs. Those warriors in feathered helmets. The Egyptians called them Peliset. Now let's open the Old Testament. It tells the story of a people who came from Kaftor, presumably Crete, and settled on the coast of Canaan around the same time. This people became the sworn enemies of the Israelites. They were called the Philistines. Peliset. Philistines. The resemblance was striking. And then archaeology supported this theory. In cities that the Bible calls Philistine, such as Ashdod and Ashkelon, archaeologists found pottery that was completely alien to the region. It was Mycenaean pottery, Greek. And then recent DNA analysis from burials in a Philistine cemetery confirmed this. These people had European roots. The circle closed. At least one part of the Sea Peoples was identified. These were people from the Aegean Islands, perhaps remnants of the collapsed Mycenaean civilization. They were defeated in Egypt, but the pharaoh allowed them to settle on the coast, where they became the Philistines, from whom the giant Goliath emerged. This was a huge breakthrough, but it only solved part of the puzzle. The Philistines were just one of many tribes. What about the others? The more scholars searched for a single homeland of the Sea Peoples, the more they realized it didn't exist. It was like trying to find the locust's nest after they had already eaten everything. They appeared from everywhere and nowhere. And then historians began to ask a different, much deeper question. What if we were looking for the wrong thing all this time? What if the Sea Peoples were not the cause of the collapse, but its most terrible symptom? This idea changes everything. It forces us to look at the entire catastrophe from a completely different angle. We were looking for a killer. But what if it was a suicide? What if the Bronze Age world was not killed but died from a systemic failure, like a complex mechanism that breaks when one key part fails? Modern historians and climatologists, using new data, have reconstructed a picture of what actually happened. And it wasn't one cause, it was a perfect storm, a deadly combination of 4 factors that hit simultaneously. The first factor was the mega-drought we discussed. It didn't just cause famine, it undermined the very foundation of the king's power. Bronze Age rulers were considered intermediaries between people and gods. Their legitimacy rested on the promise, "I will ensure your prosperity and harvest." When the harvest disappeared for decades, faith in kings vanished along with the rain. The second factor was geological. The eastern Mediterranean region is a seismically active zone, and data shows that during that period there was a so-called earthquake storm, a series of powerful earthquakes that swept across the region. They destroyed palaces, collapsed city walls, and, most importantly, disrupted the operation of ports, the vital arteries of civilization. The third factor was economic. Remember the tin. All military and economic power rested on bronze, and therefore on a fragile supply chain of tin from distant lands. When piracy and chaos disrupted these routes, supplies ceased. Empires were left without their main strategic resource. It's like if today the world suddenly ran out of oil or silicon for microchips. The production of weapons and tools stopped. The economy collapsed. And here is the fourth factor: social. Put it all together. Your fields have dried up. Your cities are destroyed by earthquakes. Your rulers cannot feed you. Your army cannot get new weapons. What will you do? You will rebel. Archaeologists find evidence of internal uprisings. Hungry peasants and townspeople rebelled against their helpless elites. It was a house of cards, and all its supports were knocked out simultaneously. And now, at the 46th minute, let's conduct a thought experiment. Imagine that today, throughout the entire planet, the Internet, GPS, and all seaports are simultaneously shut down. And on top of everything, a global drought begins. What will happen? Our civilization, with all its technologies, will collapse in a few weeks. This is exactly what happened to the Bronze Age. And in this world, a world of hunger, chaos, and ruins, the Sea Peoples are born. They are not aliens from a mysterious island. They are the inhabitants of the collapsed world themselves. These are Hittite farmers whose fields turned to dust. These are Mycenaean merchants whose ships rotted in destroyed ports. These are Syrian townspeople whose homes burned in the fire of uprisings. They gathered their families, loaded what was left onto carts and ships, and set off. This was not a conquest. It was a desperate flight. They became a wave, sweeping everything in their path because there was nothing left behind them. They were not the cause of the collapse. They were its final, most terrible consequence. When the smoke cleared, silence fell, a deafening, terrifying silence that filled the ruins of great cities. The world of palaces, international treaties, and bronze armies disappeared. What replaced it, historians call the Dark Ages. And this is not a metaphor. The light of civilization truly went out. The consequences of the systemic failure were total. In Greece, people literally forgot how to write. Linear B, a complex accounting system that managed the Mycenaean economy, disappeared without a trace for 400 years. Imagine a civilization that suffered collective amnesia. History, once again, became prehistoric. Records stopped. Technologies were lost. The art of monumental architecture was forgotten. No more cyclopean walls and opulent palaces. Pottery became crude and unadorned. Bronze, the metal of globalism, became an unattainable luxury. Iron replaced it, not because it was better, but because iron ore could be found anywhere. The world became local, poor, and isolated. But the most terrifying thing is demography. The region's population decreased by 90%. 9 out of 10 people either died or fled. Cities that once teemed with life turned into small villages, or simply into pastures for sheep, overgrown with weeds. But human memory is a strange thing. The great world did not disappear without a trace. It continued to live as a faint, distorted echo in the form of myths. Several hundred years later, as Greece slowly began to emerge from the darkness, a poet named Homer recorded stories of a heroic age, of great kings like Agamemnon, of impregnable cities like Troy, and of a 10-year war that shook the world. For a long time, this was considered fiction. But now, we understand that these were fragments of memories. A distorted memory of the grandeur of Mycenaean civilization. and the great collapse that destroyed it. And there is another myth, the story told by Plato of Atlantis, a powerful, highly developed island empire that flourished and then, in one terrible day and one night, disappeared into the depths of the sea due to the wrath of the gods. Doesn't that sound eerily familiar? The sudden and total disappearance of an entire world. Perhaps the myth of Atlantis is the deepest cultural echo that has reached us from the Bronze Age catastrophe. It took almost 400 years for the world to recover. 400 years of a long, dark night. But the story of this great collapse is not just an ancient epic of kings and monsters. It is a warning, a mirror into which we, perhaps, should look more closely. We began our investigation with a burnt clay tablet, the last breath of a dying world, and we ended it in the shadow of great myths that have survived millennia. The story of the Bronze Age collapse is not just a history lesson. It is one of the harshest warnings humanity has ever received. It's easy to look at them from the heights of our technology and think, that won't happen to us. We don't depend on tin. We have satellites, the internet, and genetically modified crops. We've built a world of steel, silicon, and fiber optics. It seems eternal. But they thought so too. Their world was destroyed by a perfect storm of climate change, supply chain disruptions, mass migration, and political instability. Now look at today's news headlines. Doesn't it sound terrifyingly familiar? Our global economy is a miracle of efficiency, but it is also incredibly fragile. One ship stuck in the Suez Canal, or one virus stopping factories on the other side of the world, and the shelves in our stores start to empty. We depend on the same sea routes as the Bronze Age kings. We face climate change that threatens droughts, famine, and rising sea levels, which could generate waves of climate refugees unprecedented in history. And we see how political polarization and distrust in institutions erode our societies from within. How strong is our civilization really? We think we built it from steel and silicon, but what if it's as fragile as the one made of bronze? The lesson of the Sea Peoples is that complex societies create complex problems. And when a system reaches a certain level of complexity, it becomes vulnerable to cascading collapse. We have one advantage they didn't. We know their story. We can read their last letter. We can see the scars on the body of history and understand what led to the catastrophe. The question is, will we learn from it? The story of the Sea Peoples is not a tale of mysterious invaders. It is a tale about us, about what happens when civilized people find themselves in desperate circumstances. They don't turn into monsters. They just try to survive. And in the process of that struggle, they can burn the world. This story is not over yet. We might be its next chapter.